Picture this. A cold Connemara morning, mist hanging low like the land itself is holding its breath. And a man who has already spent more than 2 decades behind bars suddenly claims the system might have gotten it wrong. Not a little wrong, catastrophically wrong. This is the story of a 17-year-old schoolgirl whose life was stolen, a community left shattered, and a conviction that everyone thought was sealed tighter than a Galway pub door after closing time, until now. Because out of nowhere, the man found guilty, John McDonagh, is back in court arguing that the science used to put him away belongs in a museum, that modern DNA could flip the entire case on its head, and that samples from the 1990s might still be hiding a truth no one wanted to see. And here's the part that stops you in your tracks. If he's right, this isn't just a new appeal. It's a potential earthquake in Irish criminal justice. A convicted killer demanding the one thing everyone fears, the chance to reopen the past. So let's rewind the clock. All the way back to late 1998 in rural Connemara. If you've ever been out that way, you know the vibe. Long stretches of quiet roads, sea air that carries for miles, and a community where everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows who borrowed whose lawnmower. 17-year-old Siobhán Hynes was a schoolgirl with her whole life ahead of her. The kind of teenager people describe as bright, grounded, and genuinely loved. The kind of presence that lights up small towns because everyone feels connected to her in some way. Then there's John McDonagh. At the time, he wasn't some shadowy figure from a true crime documentary. He was a familiar face in the area, not famous, not infamous, just known. But that all changed when Siobhán was found dead, and the shockwave that hit Connemara was immediate and brutal. People were scared, angry, confused, the whole emotional cocktail that lands when the unthinkable crashes into a quiet place. The investigation moved fast, the pressure was enormous, and when McDonagh was eventually convicted, many locals felt justice had been done. Case closed. Life couldn't return to normal, but at least it could continue. Except, more than 2 decades later, the case is suddenly back in the courtroom spotlight. Not because of new witnesses, not because of a confession, but because science evolved, and now the question hanging over Ireland is, did the old methods miss something the new ones could reveal? The kind of question that keeps both detectives and defense teams up at night. For years, the case seemed airtight, or at least that's how it was presented. Fibre evidence, older-style forensic comparisons, circumstantial threads woven together until they looked like a net no one could slip through. And back in the late 1990s, that was enough to land someone in prison for life. But here's where the cracks started to show. As the science evolved, the defense began asking questions that suddenly didn't sound so outrageous. Why were certain biological samples never fully tested? Why were some items examined with methods that, by today's standards, feel closer to guesswork than hard science? And why did the case lean so heavily on fibers when modern DNA technology can now pull results out of samples once considered useless? Then came a bigger red flag. Several pieces of evidence collected at the time were preserved, but never subjected to advanced DNA analysis because those techniques simply did not exist yet. So, when McDonagh's legal team looked back and said, hold on, these could actually be tested now, it forced people to acknowledge something uncomfortable. If the science that helped convict him was limited, outdated, and incomplete, what does that say about the certainty of the conviction? These weren't whispers from internet forums or pub gossip. These were concerns laid out in official appeal documents. Questions that weren't just technical but fundamental. And the moment those questions hit daylight, the case stopped feeling like a closed chapter and started feeling like a door someone might have locked too quickly. Siobhán Hynes' final day in 1998 unfolded like any ordinary one in a small Irish community, until it didn't. She left home, went about her routine, and moved through a world that felt familiar and safe. Nothing publicly reported suggests she crossed paths with danger beforehand. No dramatic foreshadowing, no obvious warning signs. Just the quiet rhythm of Connemara life. When she didn't come home, the worry kicked in fast. This wasn't the kind of place where a 17-year-old simply vanished into thin air. Families watch out for each other, neighbors notice everything, and word spreads faster than a gale coming off the Atlantic. Her disappearance sparked an immediate search. locals, friends, family, and eventually the authorities combing through roads, fields, and shoreline. And then the worst fear became reality. Siobhán was found dead. The community's world tilted on its axis in that moment. Investigators followed the physical clues available at the time. They collected clothing, fibers, hair, and any trace material that might paint even the faintest picture of what happened in those missing hours. Back then, DNA analysis was nowhere near what it is today. Forensic science relied heavily on pattern-based matching, fiber similarities, and context. From those early examinations, suspicion began to point toward John McDonagh. Investigators believed fibre evidence connected him to Siobhán, and combined with circumstantial details, the timeline twisted sharply toward a single conclusion: he was their suspect. Within months, the narrative hardened, the investigation narrowed, the prosecution built its case, and the community, grieving, angry, searching for closure, leaned into the belief that the right man had been found. But with every year that passed, as forensic science took leap after leap forward, the timeline of this case became less a straight line and more a question mark waiting to be redrawn. The real shift didn't happen in '98. It didn't happen during the trial. It happened many years later, when science finally outgrew the case. For John McDonagh, the turning point came the moment someone realized that several pieces of evidence from the original investigation had never been tested with modern DNA techniques. Not partially tested, not inconclusive, literally never examined using the tools we now take for granted. Think about that for a second. For more than 2 decades, he sat in a prison cell while biological samples that might confirm guilt or reveal something entirely different, stayed sealed in storage, untouched by the technological revolution happening in forensic labs across the world. So McDonagh did the one thing a person claiming innocence can do in that position. He pushed for the Court of Appeal to reopen the scientific side of the case. And here's the twist. This isn't a man simply shouting into the wind. His legal team presented a structured argument that the fiber-based evidence used to convict him was built on a method considered outdated by today's standards, that the original forensic conclusions could be strengthened or undermined depending on what the new tests reveal, and that justice, if it's going to mean anything, should embrace the best science available, not cling to the limitations of the past. The court didn't laugh it off. They didn't dismiss it with a wave of the hand. They listened. Because when an old case meets new science, even the strongest convictions can suddenly feel like they're standing on shifting sand. This was the moment when the story stopped being a tragic closed chapter and started becoming a high-stakes question. What happens if the truth was sitting in a freezer the whole time? To understand why this appeal matters so much, you have to look at what the guards actually did back in 1998 and what they couldn't do because of the limits of the time. Once Siobhán's body was found, the investigation moved fast. The guards worked through the night, pulling in every tool available then: fiber comparisons, soil traces, hair analysis, and the early stages of DNA profiling. But DNA profiling in the late 90s was nothing like the razor-sharp genetic fingerprinting we use today. It was slow, expensive, and frequently inconclusive, which meant investigators leaned heavily on fibers and circumstantial overlap. That's exactly how the net tightened around John McDonagh. Fibers believed to match clothing, transfer patterns, environmental traces. Pieces that made sense at the time stitched together under enormous pressure to find answers. But here's where the case gets sticky. First, biological samples, including some that could now yield clear DNA results, were collected but never tested beyond the older era methods. Not because anyone ignored them, but because the technology simply wasn't advanced enough to produce meaningful results. Second, the forensic techniques used in the trial relied on similarity assessments that modern experts often view as supportive rather than conclusive. In 1998, those assessments carried heavy weight. Today, they would be considered a starting point, not the finish line. Third, the defense argues that some forensic interpretations may have presented stronger certainty than the underlying science could actually support. So when McDonagh's legal team filed the appeal, they weren't just throwing theories at the wall, they were directly targeting the foundation of the original conviction. The science was limited. Several samples were never fully analyzed. Modern methods could affirm the conviction or unravel it. Even the Court of Appeal acknowledged this wasn't just legal noise. If updated DNA testing can clarify what older tests couldn't, then refusing to examine the evidence would raise serious questions about fairness and accuracy. In other words, the investigation did the best it could back then, but back then might no longer be good enough. Now, before we go any further, let's make something crystal clear. This case has one convicted man, John McDonagh, and the appeal does not introduce any new suspects. There is no mystery lineup, no dramatic twist where half the village suddenly becomes a theory. Everything here stays firmly within the verified facts and what was raised by investigators or in court. Back in 1998, the prosecution's focus landed squarely on McDonagh. Their theory was straightforward. Fibre evidence and forensic traces allegedly linked him to Siobhán during the critical window of time. Witness context and environmental similarities helped reinforce the narrative, and the jury accepted that picture. But over time, the defense began to challenge not the story but the science behind it. Here are the key factual theories raised publicly. Theory 1. The original conviction was correct. This is the view the state maintains. They argue that the fibre matches, the combination of circumstantial evidence and the investigative timeline all pointed convincingly toward McDonagh. From this perspective, modern DNA testing would likely confirm the conclusion, not undermine it. Theory 2. The forensic base was too weak. McDonagh's team argues the conviction depended heavily on fibre comparison, a method less definitive than modern DNA. They say that without updated testing, nobody can fully assess whether the original interpretation was accurate or whether similarities were coincidental. Theory 3. Untested samples could hold the real answer. This is the entire backbone of the appeal. Several biological samples collected at the time may still contain preserved DNA. If modern high-sensitivity testing finds DNA that contradicts the original theory, or fails to find McDonagh's DNA where it should be if the prosecution narrative is correct, the case could shift dramatically. No one is accusing anyone else. No alternative perpetrator has been suggested by the defense. No public theory has introduced a second suspect. This appeal isn't about pointing fingers at new people. It's about questioning whether the evidence that put McDonagh away for more than 20 years was strong enough by today's standards. In other words, this section of the story isn't about who else. It's about what if the science wasn't enough. And here's where the whole thing hangs in a strange, suspenseful limbo, somewhere between a scientific breakthrough and a legal traffic jam. When McDonagh's appeal reached the Court of Appeal, the judges didn't brush it aside. They didn't call it frivolous. They didn't say the conviction was beyond question. Instead, they acknowledged a simple, uncomfortable truth. Forensic science from the late 1990s is not the same beast as forensic science today. The court heard arguments that several items collected at the scene, items that were stored, preserved, and still available, had never undergone modern DNA analysis. Not low-level testing, not high-sensitivity profiling, nothing that could take advantage of the tech we now rely on in nearly every major case. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows. But the real moment of tension came when McDonagh's lawyers argued that updated testing might not just add information, it could either reinforce the conviction or completely destabilize it. The state didn't dispute that the science had advanced, they simply maintained confidence in the original verdict. So now the entire case is at a crossroads. If the court approves testing, we could be weeks or months away from answers that were impossible in 1998. If the court refuses, the conviction remains as it is, but with a shadow cast over the certainty that once surrounded it. This is why the story feels frozen in place. The evidence is sitting there, the technology exists. The question is whether the legal system is willing to crack open a decades-old case and let 21st century science speak. For the families involved, this limbo is its own kind of pain. A future that depends entirely on what a laboratory might reveal from samples untouched for more than 20 years. And until the court rules, the entire case feels like a breath held halfway, waiting for the exhale. For the community, this appeal didn't just reopen an old case, it reopened old wounds. Connemara is the kind of place where people remember where they were when tragedy struck, and Siobhán Hynes' death left a mark that still sits heavy in local memory. To many, the conviction brought a sense of closure, fragile, imperfect, but something to hold on to. Now, With McDonagh challenging that verdict, the certainty people relied on is suddenly being tested just as much as the evidence itself. For Siobhán's family, this isn't a headline, it's not a legal puzzle. It's the return of a pain they've lived with for more than 2 decades. And yet, they also want the truth, whatever form it takes. That's the part people sometimes forget. Families don't fear science, they fear being left in the dark. For McDonagh's side, the appeal represents the possibility, however small or large, that the narrative built in 1998 might not match what modern forensic analysis could show. It's a lifeline wrapped in uncertainty. Legally, the case is now part of a bigger conversation happening across Ireland and beyond. What do we owe to the truth when science evolves? How do we handle convictions from eras where forensic tools were limited, or interpretation wasn't as precise as today? And what does justice look like when the past isn't as final as everyone once believed? Socially, the case triggered a wave of public debate, everything from genuine concern to armchair commentary. Some people see the appeal as a necessary safeguard against wrongful convictions. Others see it as reopening a wound for no good reason. Most fall somewhere in between, hoping the process leads to clarity, whatever form that clarity takes. But the biggest consequence, the one nobody can escape, is this. Ireland is watching closely. Because if old evidence can be retested using new science, this case may become a precedent for others. A single appeal might end up shaping how the justice system handles historical convictions in the future. In the end, this case comes down to one haunting question. What if the truth didn't change? Only our ability to see it did. A 17-year-old girl's life was taken, a community was shattered, and a man has spent more than 2 decades behind bars. Now, the past is knocking again. Not with new witnesses, not with dramatic confessions, but with the cold precision of science that didn't exist when the verdict was first cast. If the court allows the retesting, the answers could either strengthen the foundation of the original conviction or crack it wide open. And if they refuse, the doubts will linger like fog over the Connemara hills, leaving everyone to wonder what might have been revealed in a modern lab. Because sometimes the most terrifying part of a true crime story isn't what happened back then. It's what we might still discover now. If you want fast updates on Irish true crime, subscribe. We cover everything before it hits mainstream headlines.